this is saying, so the 15th, 6th, so second day, third day, so tomorrow will be Shasiyah.
All right, Jerosai, good morning, a good night, everyone. Let us begin. Beginning by thanking today's sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month, and the Schusar of Shalema for their grandsons, Zechariah Dov, Ben Perel Shira, Shadin Avram Kelman, in memory of their beloved parents, and the Schus of all those who need a Refuah Shalema. Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband of 53 years, Peretz Moshe ben Avram David. Leah Sol is a schus for a fushleima for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and for all those in need of Yeshuas. Our week of learning sponsors, Ira Grossman, in creation of the 12th yahrzeit of his father, Melvin Grossman, Melech ben Azriel, and Valerie Asapov is schus for a fushleima, a quick recovery return for good health for Irina Basmilin. Thank you. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos, Av and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all those who require refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. So Meretz Hashem, today's daf is daf Nun 50. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah on the bottom of Mem Tes Amud Beis, 49b. So the Mishnah says as follows. The Mishnah writes, the Mishnah says, Amanash Shani Kohen. So remember again, continuing on the topic over here of where the individual goes ahead and makes a Tanai, what appears to be a Tanai in the Kiddushin, and what happens in the event that the Tanai does not materialize. So the Mishnah says as follows, Almanas Shani Kohen. If a person says, right, Reuven says to Rachel, marry me on the condition that I am a Kohen, V'nimtza Levi, and it turns out that he's a Levi, or Levi v'nimtza Kohen, or vice versa, Nisin v'nimtza Mamzer, marry me on the condition that I'm in a sin, but it turns out that he's a Mamzer, Mamzer v'nimtza Nisin, Ben Ir v'nimtza Ben Krach, marry me on the condition that I live in a city, and it turns out that he lives in a village, Ben Krach v'nimtza Ben Ir, or vice versa, Almanas shebesi karov l'merchatz, on the condition that my home is close to the bathhouse, v'nimtza rachok, and it turns out that it's far away, rachok v'nimtza karov, or on the condition that it's far away from the bathhouse, it turns out that it's close by, Almanas sheyesh li bas o shivcha megudelas, on the condition that I have a daughter or an adult maid servant, ve'ein lo, almanas she'ein lo v'yesh lo, or vice versa, almanas she'ein lo banim v'yesh lo, on the condition I don't have children, it does have children, o almanas she'ein lo v'yesh lo, ubekulam. So we'll say, so again, essentially what the Mishnah is saying is the Tanai itself is inconsequential. Whatever the Tanai is, the Tanai is. The point over here in all of these cases is that he has predicated the Kiddushin on the particular reality. And it turns out that reality didn't materialize. The Kiddushin is not good. The Kiddushin is not valid. He says, "Ubekulam afapi sha'amra b'libi haya li skadish lo afapikin." Now, so let's say again, in any of these cases, see, he makes the Tanai. The Tanai itself doesn't materialize on a simple level, right? Marry me on the condition that my home is close to the bathhouse. Turns out that his home is far from the bathhouse. So Rabbi says, so the Kiddushin is not good. Rachel turns around and says, yeah, but it didn't really matter to me. That kind of stuff doesn't really matter to me. Even if she says that she was willing to accept the Kiddushin, even without the Tanai, nevertheless, Ina Mikudeshas. In all of these cases, she's still not Mikudeshas. Why? She said she doesn't care. It's inconsequential. At the end of the day, since the Kiddushin was predicated on this Tanai, and she accepted the Kiddushin with this Tanai, even if she turns around and says, yeah, but it didn't matter all that much to me, nevertheless, the Kiddushin itself is void. V'chein hu, v'chein hi, shit aso. Now, I will say all of these cases obviously are framed as he's making the Tanai to her. But the truth is, all of these same halachos would apply even if what? She made the Tanai to him. In other words, so it makes no difference who's making the Tanai. At the end of the day, if Kiddushin is made with the Tanai and the Tanai doesn't materialize, halacha l'maisa, the Kiddushin is not good. Says the Gemara. Well, it's a very interesting cases here. Ho gavra, de zobin, l'nechase adaita l'mesech l'eretz Yisrael. Interesting case. There was an individual who ultimately again sold this property with the intention to move to Eretz Yisrael. Right? That was his kavana. So what happens? Ubeidna de zobin lo amar v'lo midi. So we'll say, now watch this. It's actually a fascinating case. Reuven wants to move to Eretz Yisrael. So what does he do? He sells his house. Now, Ruvain makes no mention that he's selling his house to move to Eretz Yisrael, right? He doesn't make mention of that. So we'll say what happens. So we'll say, so now there's a missing part of the story. The missing part of the story is he doesn't end up moving. So in other words, Ruvain sold his house. Now his kavana is he's moving to Eretz Yisrael. Turns out then his aliyah plans were upended, and I will say he's got a problem. What's his problem? He has no Eretz Yisrael and no house. So of course, if you're Ruvain, what's your plan? You're going to go back to the seller and go back to the buyer and say, listen, I only sold the house with the intention of moving to Eretz Yisrael. Now, ultimately, again, I wasn't able to move, so I'd like my house back. So what's the halacha? Amirava have a dvarim shebalev, udvarim shebalev einam dvarim. What's an incredible story? Rava says these are matters of the heart. Dvarim shebalev. In other words, you had an intention over here. I understand you had a whole cheshbon, but your cheshbon was something you never expressed, you never articulated, something you have. So a kavanah you have in your heart that is not expressed to someone else, ultimately, again, is halachically inconsequential. Dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. So the Gemara says, okay, and therefore Rava says, even though Ruvain clearly was motivated to only sell his house because he was making aliyah, because he never expressed that at the time of the sale, therefore halacha l'maisa, he can't go ahead and walk back the sale because of his inability to make aliyah. Incredible. So the Gemara says, udvarim shebalev einam dvarim minalei. From where do we know that concept? That dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. That things, in other words, we'll say, so this is a transactional concept. That if you're engaging in a transaction and you have certain kavanas about the transaction, but you did not express those kavanas, that they do not play a transactional role. From where do we know that concept? So the Gemara says, Minalei the Ravaha, Ilema mehadis, maybe you'll say it's from here. Top of Nun. So the pasuk says, Yakriv also, Melame Chekofen also. Supposed to listen to this. That Torah is talking about over here, Im Ola Karbana min Abaka min Ezachar. So the Torah is talking about over here, that Allah says, if you have an obligation to go ahead and bring a carbon, so the Torah says, Yakriv Oso. Now, what does Yakriv Oso teach us? Melame Chekofen Oso. You could force a person to fulfill their carbonic obligations. Yochel Bar Kocho. You would think maybe you could force a person to give a carbon even against their will. Talmud Lomar Lirtzono. Therefore, the pasuk says no. The carbon is only given in accordance with his will. So we'll say, how does that stem? On one hand, you're saying you could force him to give the carbon. Then you're also saying the carbon can only be given in accordance with his will. So how do you reconcile those two concepts? Hakesad kolfino so achiomerosa ani. Ultimately, you could force him to bring his carbon. In other words, you could compel him to bring the carbon. Compel him, force him until he says, fine, I'm willing to do it. The Gemara says, but how does that work? Maybe he's saying with his lips, I'm willing to do it, but in his heart, he's like, no, I don't want to do this. So what do you see from here, Abosai? We don't care what you think. The thing you're thinking about doesn't matter. What matters? We'll say two things that matter. Two things that matter in the transactional world. Number one, what you say. Number two, what you do. What you're thinking is absolutely inconsequential. Vidilma shiny hasam. Maybe the carbon case is different. Why? Because also the carbon case is an objective benefit to bring your carbon, because the carbon affects some type of kapar. Now granted, the carbon in question over here is an ola being brought for a neder, but still, all carbonos affect some level of kapara, some level of atonement. So that's why maybe there's an objective benefit for this guy, and that's why ultimately, even if he doesn't really want to do it, we treat it as if he does. Elami Seifa. So Rabbi say again, just to be clear, Rava introduced us to the halachic concept of dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. Things that you think, right? Things that you have in your heart are halachically inconsequential. We're trying to find the makar. What is the source for that concept? So maybe it's from here. Elami Seifa. So do you find about by gittin? Right, a get given to a woman. Shechrui avadim, documents of emancipation given to avadim. Kolfin also achiyam rotzani. Ultimately, again, you could force a man to divorce his wife. Right, you could force a man to emancipate his slave. He says he doesn't want to. You could compel him to do it until he says, okay, I'll do it. Va'amai. We'll say first wide line, Nunamadal 50a. But why does that work? Habali be'lo nechale. In his heart, he doesn't want to do it, right? He might be saying I'm willing to do it, but in his heart, he doesn't want to do it. Rather, it must be that what Rabbi is saying. Once again, we don't care what you think. What do we care? We care about two things in halacha: what you do and what you say. But maybe this case is different because remember again, in any case where you're forcing him to give a get or forcing him to emancipate the slave, who's doing the forcing? Beis Din, which means that there's a mitzvah l'shmo derech chachamim. There's a mitzvah to listen to Chazal. So maybe that case is different. Maybe we could compel him, even though in his heart he doesn't really want to do it, because at the end of the day, every Yid wants to perform a mitzvah. This is his mitzvah. To which the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rav Yosef mihacha. So we'll say a new source. Again, we're just trying to figure out what is the source for Dvarim Shebalev Einam Dvarim. Amar Rav Yosef mihacha. Hamakadesh es haisha v'man betrothed woman v'amar kasavra hayisi shehi kohanes. I thought that she was a kohanes. V'hari Levia. She's Levia. Levia v'nimsa is kohanes. Aniya v'hari. I thought she was poor. She's really rich. Ashira v'hari aniya. Mikudashas. At the end of the day, she's Mikudash, right? Mikudashas. Why? Mipnei shelo tehita aso. See what I say? In those cases, the man had an assumption. She never presented herself as a kohanes, as a levia, as an aniyah, or a shia. He assumed she was like. So it turned out that his assumption was false. Assumption was wrong, was incorrect. So I'll say in that case, ultimately the Kiddushin is good. Why? Because she didn't actively misrepresent herself. Va'amai. But one second, we'll say he's telling us, in my heart, I thought that she was a kohenes, that she was a levia. Why doesn't that matter? So we'll see, you see from here that again, thoughts, right, things that you think in your heart or in your mind are halachically inconsequential. One second. Maybe that case will say it's different, because ultimately, again, we're being machmir to say that the Kiddushin is valid. Abai says from here, Bekulam afapi sha'amra belibi haya lis kaddish lo, afapi ke'ena mikudeshes. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Abai actually says the raya, right, the proof that Dvarim Shebalev Einam Dvarim is actually from our Mishnah. We'll say, what was the case in our Mishnah? In our Mishnah, you had all of these different Tunaim, right? Become a Kudesh, just mean the condition this, that. Turns out the condition doesn't materialize. What does she say, right? What does Rachel, the wife, say in all these cases? To be honest, I don't really care, right? All of this stuff didn't really matter to me. Even though she says that, what's the halacha? She's not Mikudeshas. What do you see from here? So I'll say, you see from here that even though she said it was in my heart, that it didn't really matter, you see from here, Dvarim Shebalev Einam Dvarim. I v'dilma shiny hasam, kevan da'asne, lav kol kamine da'akra leile tinai. Now I'll say, maybe that case is different, because remember, in all of these cases in the Mishnah, he is making an active tinai. Right, so we'll say, when you make an active tinai, explicit tinai, so again, everyone will agree that whatever you're thinking in your heart doesn't undermine an active tinai. There was a story in that, right? Or this occurred in the, or I should say, this was discussed. So I'll say, remember again, we're focused over here. We're looking for a source for the concept of Dvarim Shebalev Einam Dvarim. Where do we know that concept from? So the Gemara says, I'll say, watch this. I say to my agent, do me a favor, bring me money from the windowsill or from the basket. My agent did it. So we'll say, now it turns out, by the way, just the parentheses in this is, the money was consecrated money. Now watch this. Now it turns out that, for example, the money on the windowsill was consecrated. The money in the basket ultimately was not. I then say, so what happens? The shaliach ends up bringing me the consecrated money. I say, oh, you know what? I really had in mind for the money in the basket, the unconsecrated money. So when Abai says, you know, I really had in mind for the money in the basket, which was unconsecrated. So you see from here, because we say that which you think is inconsequential, V'dilma shani hasam dilamifter nafshemi carbon kasi. Maybe we'll say, no, in that case, we don't believe the guy, right? We don't believe me. Why? Because clearly I'm only saying what I'm saying in order to go ahead and exempt myself from liability. The Gemara says, one second. If I want to exempt myself from liability, there's an easier way. I could say I purposely used consecrated funds. And what happens if you say I purposely used consecrated funds? You're exempt from carbonic liability. To which Gemara says, no one's ever going to say that. Lo avid inish the mashvi nafshe rishia. Person's not going to make himself into a rasha. Havele lomar niskarti. He could have said niskarti. I remembered before I used the money. I remembered which money was which. This not niskar balabayis, velo niskar shliach mal. Ultimately, again, he could say, because remember, if the balabais remembers which money was consecrated, which money was not, then ultimately, again, the balabais is off the hook with mi'ilah, and the mi'ilah liability is upon the shaliach. Okay, so I'll say, so bottom line, the Gemara doesn't really seem to bring a conclusive proof for the source, for Dvarim Shebalev Einam Dvarim. Yet Rabbi say we know that in fact it is a halachic precept. In transactional law, anything you're thinking is absolutely irrelevant. What frames the parameters of a particular transaction is either what you explicitly say or what you do in the course of that transaction. Incredible. So some more stories. Hu gavra tizabinu l'nechase adai t'lamesach la'ardi Yisrael. Shabbos said there was a guy, once again, sold his property with the intention to go up to Eretz Yisrael. Shabbos said, now, what's different in this case over here is he went ahead and he explicitly articulated that. Rashi says, so by the way, just before we go on, so that's how we paskin, right? Dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, right? That which you think in a transaction, if you did not explicitly articulate it, that which you think is absolutely irrelevant. Rabbi say it is important to say that is how we paskin halacha l'maisa, not how we paskin hashkafa l'maisa, right? In other words, we paskin. So again, remember in halacha, dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. In ruchnius, dvarim shebalev, absolutely dvarim. I will say, by the way, the proof to that was yesterday's daf. What did we have in yesterday's daf? A man goes over to a woman and he says to her, Hari'at nikudeshas li amanas sha'ani tzadik. Amanas sha'ani tzadik gomer. Right, or tzadik. So what's talacha? What did the Gemara say? Afilu rasha gomer mikudeshas. Even if he's a Russian. Why? Shema hirhur tshuva bedaito. Maybe he had thoughts of tshuva. Thoughts of tshuva, what do you call that? That's dvarim shebalev. That's dvarim shebalev. Yet Rabbi say we see that Allah Chalamaisa, she's mikudeshas. So once you see something very profound over here, you see the world of transactional law. The world of transactional law is olam hazeh. Olam hazeh is governed by results, is governed by tachlis, right? So tachlis, you want to engage in a transaction, ultimately, I don't care what you're thinking, we don't care what your thoughts are. What we care is what you say and what you do. Rabbi say, by the way, it has to be that way. Can you imagine what the business world would look like, Rabbi say, if suddenly transactions were governed by what people are thinking? Right? It would be impossible to go ahead and ever produce any type of transaction that would stand on its own. So in transactional law, you have to say dvarim shebalev einam dvarim. Rabbi say, but the beauty is in ruchnius. The Ribono Shel Olam always looks not just at what we do, but the beauty of one of the beautiful parts of the Ribono Shel Olam is he is the Bochen Levavos. He is able to see what is in my heart. Because sometimes, for whatever the reason, I can't produce results in life. Sometimes I'm just not in a place where I'm able to produce results. So I will say in the world, if you can't produce results, right, what's your status? If you can't produce results? Failure, unemployed, right? You are a failure. Right? We always get this much. I imagine you go into work, you're playing Tetris all day, you tell your boss, you know what, but I want you to know my heart is really in this job, right? In my heart, I'm batting 1,000. In my heart, I closed 4 deals today, right? In my heart, I did this. Your boss is going to say, good. And in your heart, pack your stuff, right? Let me say, go. Let's say it works in the world. The world is very results driven. The beauty of Ruchnius. So now I want to be clear. Ruchnius is also results driven, right? If a person says their whole life, I'm a good Jew in my heart and I have beautiful shifas, beautiful aspirations, and they produce or they do nothing, that's not a good life either. But the reality is that sometimes in life, at the by the way, it's incredible. Here's the contrast. See, just a few feet away, they're building a building. See, I will say, when it comes to building Gashmius, results are determined, or I should say, success is determined by results. Right? A successful day, more steel is going to go up. In the world of Ruchnius, so ultimately you also need results. But she'ifas, your desires matter a lot as well. That's why again, right? Again, shemechir b'tshuva. What I'm thinking matters. We'll say again, the Rebbe Shalom sees our desires, he sees our wants, he sees what we want to accomplish. So in Ruchnius, Dvarim Shebalev, Havim Dvarim as well. What you think, what you want, what you desire matters greatly in the eyes of the Rebbe Shalom. So let's go weiter. Supposed to say there was an individual, ultimately again, who went up, sold his house, sold his property to make aliyah. So what happens? Well, now in this case, he goes, right? Now a lot is happening over here. First of all, in this case, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain makes it clear why he's selling his home. Right? He makes it clear. For sale sign, moving to Israel, right? He's got it's all there, full disclosure. Now we'll say, he sells the house, he goes on aliyah. Now what happens over here? The Meis there, so Salik, follow Itztar. He goes, didn't work out. Unfortunately, didn't work out. So now he has to move back, right? So what was I say? So now he moves back. Now what's his first stop when he moves back? First stop, he knocks on the door, right? He says, listen, Shimon, how's the house going? How are things? I'm so sorry. The aliyah plans didn't work out. I want to be a nice guy. You've got 30 days to vacate the premises, right? Because Lamai said, I sold my house, again, with the condition that I was making aliyah. It didn't work out. I'm back. Obviously, again, Ruvain's, essentially, say, what is Ruvain claiming, essentially? What is Ruvain claiming? Ruvain's claiming, effectively, it was a conditional sale. So I need my home back. Amar Rava called the Salik Adaita Lemeidarhu Vaha Lo Itztar. So we'll say, so Rava said, ultimately again, so Rava actually posits that, listen, obviously anytime you sell your home to go to Eretz Yisrael, the intention is what? The intention ultimately is to live there, and he wasn't able to live there. Rashi says, V'lo yachal ladar, o mishum chisr mezonos, o lo matzadira. Whatever didn't work out, it didn't work out. So therefore again, Reuven effectively sold his home on a Tanai. He wasn't able to make it work in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore according to Ravi, he actually has the ability to go ahead and cancel the sale. Incredible. So the Gemara says, What's the other opinion says, no, you sold your home with the intention to move to Eretz Yisrael. Did you move to Eretz Yisrael? Yeah. Did he move? Yeah. Okay, the fact that it didn't work out afterwards, that's something totally separate. In other words, so I'll give you a good example. If Reuven were to sell his home, right, say I'm moving to Eretz Yisrael, and then Rabbi say, again, there's no way to get to Eretz Yisrael. Right? COVID, right? Right? They shut down the borders. Right? So we'll say, okay, if they shut down the borders and you can't go, that might be grounds to void the sale, because you can't get there. But if you get there, but whatever, you couldn't find an apartment, you couldn't find a job, that's already a separate parasha. In other words, you sold to get there, you got there. Once you get there, that's it. The transaction is closed off. You can't renege it anymore. Hu gavra. Another Sarah say, Gavra, who sold his property ultimately again with the intention to go to Eretz Yisrael. Losof lo salik. At the end, he didn't go. Okay, he didn't go. So we'll say, so what's that? Ravashi says, listen, he didn't go. Why didn't he go? I don't know why he didn't go, but that's his problem. In other words, he could have gone. Ravashi says, if he wanted to go, he could go. The fact that he didn't go, that's on him. Ikidam, you're supposed to say an alternate version of this. Ibai lo salik. So what's the other version? It's an interactive. If he wanted to go, could he not have gone? Or is Ibai lo salik? Could he have gone if he wanted to? So we'll say, what's the nafkamina between these two approaches? Ikabinayu, desyalet onsa ba'archa. So we'll say the nafkamina would be ultimately, again, let's say Reuven sold this house to go to Eretz Yisrael. He wanted to go, but then he found out that the journey was a little bit dangerous. was a little bit dangerous. Look at Rashi. So according to the first lashon, Reuven wouldn't be able to avoid the sale. Why? Because even though it's dangerous, he could still go. He could still go. According to the second version, since he has a good reason not to go, he would have a right to go ahead and void the transaction. So I will say, so you begin to see in all of these different cases, again, the point of all these cases is that Allah Lamaisa, if Reuven wants an out, for when he's selling his house to make aliyah, he could have an out, right? He could bake in whatever tanoim, whatever conditions he wants. But I will say, but what ultimately comes out is that Allah, if he sells to go to Eretz Yisrael, he makes it to Eretz Yisrael. But it doesn't work out from Eretz Yisrael, and now he wants to come back. He can't void the sale. And of course, I will say the overarching concept over here is Dvarim shevalei einam dvarim. That in general, when entering into a transaction, even though you had all of your kavanas in the transaction, your kavanas are inconsequential. Only what you say and what you do matters in the scope of the transaction. I will tell you how beautiful and incredible it is that we have these cases of moving to Eretz Yisrael on Chalamayit Sukkis. I will say there's a mitzvah on Sukkis, there's a mitzvah on Yom Tov of Aliyah L'Regel. Of going up to Eretz Yisrael, going up to Yerushalayim. So I will say, so I'll tell you, like, sometimes you think about it, so what do I do? Like, here, there's a mitzvah that we're not fulfilling, right? We're all here. It's okay, it's great weather, it's nice to be with the Chevra, beautiful davening, beautiful Yom Tiv, but I'm not being Ola Regel. So I will say, so remember again, we mentioned this on Yom Tiv, whenever you can't perform a particular mitzvah, so what are you supposed to do? Learn the Torah associated with that mitzvah. We spoke about this on Shabbos. We weren't able to take Daled Minim on Shabbos, so we learned about the Daled Minim. So we're Mekayim to a certain degree. So again, I guess I'm able, but I'm not going to Eretz Yisrael now. So I will say, how beautiful is it? How beautiful is it that Halach Lamayis on first day Chalamayid, the Ribono Shel Olam gave us a Gemara about going to Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara gave us cases about going to Eretz Yisrael. So if we're not yet going to Eretz Yisrael, at least there's a partial kiyum of being Ola Regel by learning Gemaras associated with moving up to Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. Jessica will say another kiss on the Ribbon Shalom. Let's go back to Mishnah. Ha'omer l'shlucho. A man says to Shaliach, say, the Kaddish the Isha Plonis Makom Ploni. So what happens? We'll say, Reuven tells the Shaliach, go and be Mekadesh Rachel, by specific woman, in Pikesville. Actually, let's make it Yerushalayim. Let's make it Yerushalayim, right? Go and be Mekadesh Rachel for me in Yerushalayim. And what happens? It turns out that the Shaliach is Mekadesh Rachel, for Reuven, but he does it in Tel Aviv. So what's the halacha? Ein Mekudeshes. Ultimately, again, it's not Mekudeshes. Why? Why not Mekudeshes? He made it Tanai. So we view it as a Tanai. Go and be Mekadesh Rachel in Yerushalayim. Ultimately, again, is a Tanai. And therefore, if he's Mekadesh Rachel somewhere else, ultimately, again, the Kiddushin is not good. Hari b'makom ploni v'kidshon makom acher. What happens if Reuven says to Shaliach, you'll find Rachel in Yerushalayim, and he ends up being Mekadesh Rachel in Tel Aviv, Harizim Mikudeshas. Ultimately, again, that works. So we'll say, now what's the distinction between the two cases? In case number one, telling the Shlech to be Mekadesh in Yerushalayim is a T'nai. That's why I want the Kiddushin done. In case number two, it's what we call a Maramakum. Maramakum. He said to Shliach, you'll be able to find Rachel in Yerushalayim. But in other words, it's not a T'nai that he has to be Mekadesh in Yerushalayim. It says in Gemara, T'nai nami gabe gittin. We see this by gittin as well. Ha'omer tznu gets a lishti, b'makom ploni. Right? Reuven says to the Shaliach, give a get to my wife in Yerushalayim. V'nosal makom achar. He gives it to her ultimately again in Tel Aviv. Possible. The get is invalid. Hare hibe makom ploni. If Reuven says Shliach, you'll find my wife in Yerushalayim, the nastin laba makom acher, and he ends up giving her the get in Tel Aviv, then kasher. I will say why. Same distinction. Case one is a t'nai. Case two is just a point of information. Now, why do you need to illustrate this concept both by Gittin and Kiddushin? I'll tell you why. Utzvicha, Tiashmin Gabi Kiddushin, if you would have just said by Kiddushin, the Gemara says, B'makom de l'korva ka'asi, b'hai asar rachmuli, v'lo memali mili alai, b'hadi asra suddenly, memali mili alai. So I'll say, maybe in the case of Kiddushin, you'll say like this. Since Reuven wants to marry Rachel, he tells the Shaliach do the Kiddushin in a place where they like me. Because this way, if Rachel asks about me, they'll have good things to say about me. I'm concerned I don't have a good reputation everywhere, so I want to be careful where they do the Kiddushin. However, when it comes to divorce, at this point, Reuven probably doesn't care too much what people have to say about him, right? In other words, he doesn't care where the get is given. What people are going to say, the get's given in a particular place, Reuven's not a good guy. Again, he's divorcing his wife anyway. How did it just said about Gerushin? Bahai asra nechalei, denivzi, bahai asra lo nechalei. Aval gabi kiddushin emalo ichpaslei. You both say by Gerushin, maybe you would say maybe he's more makbid. He only wants to get given in a particular place. He doesn't want to become a degrading experience, right? But by kiddushin, ultimately again, it doesn't matter where it's given. Therefore, it's in both cases. I both say so. Bottom line, the distinction is like this. When I tell a shaliach to specifically do something in a particular place, to execute an agency in a particular place, so ultimately, again, I will say that is the status of a t'nai, of a condition. And therefore, if the shaliach executes the agency in a different place, the agency is voided and the act is irrelevant. If, however, I give the geographic location as a way of making the shaliach's life easier, right? You could find Rachel in Yerushalayim. So what am I doing? What am I doing? That's not a t'nai. That's a point of information to make the shliach's execution of his agency a little bit easier. But if he ends up executing the agency elsewhere, halacha l'maisa, that's totally fine as well. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Interesting case. Reuven is Mekadesh Rachel on the condition that she does not have any existing vows upon her. And it turns out that she has some pre-existing vows. Ultimately, she's not Mekudeshes. So I both say, in general, this has to do, it's just an explicit t'nai, right? I'm marrying you on the condition you have no pre-existing Nedarim, right? It turns out she has Nedarim. No t'nai, no Kiddushin. Kinsa stam. What happens if he just marries her stam? It doesn't say anything, and it turns out it turns out she has nedarim. Teitzei shelo b'ksuva. Wow. So when it says halacha l'maisa, he has a right to divorce her, right? With a get, she still requires a get, but without a ksuva. Now we'll say the reason without a ksuva is that's a penalty. Why? Because the general assumption is a man doesn't want to marry a woman who is a habitual vower, right? Because halacha l'maisa, the concern it's not a good midah. It's not a good midah, right? That's not, we saw this before in the Nedarim, right? Amanas she'en aleh woman. What happens if a man marries a woman on the condition that you don't have any blemishes? V'nimtzu bam woman. Turns out she is woman. So what's the halacha? In mekudesh, she's not mekudesh. I'm going to say again, that's a straightforward case. He made it tonight. Kansa stam. What happens if he marries her stam? Doesn't make a condition. V'nimtzu bam woman. It turns out she has blemishes. I'm going to say again, we'll discuss what type of blemishes. Tates, and I'm going to say it means something more significant. Teitzei shelo b'ksuba. Ultimately, he could divorce her with a get, but she forfeits her ksuba. Shekala mumina posel mikohanim posel menashin. Any mum, Rabbi say, that ultimately again would invalidate a kohen from avoda, ultimately goes ahead and any mum that would invalidate a kohen from doing the avoda, ultimately again is grounds for dissolution of a marriage with a get, but with the forfeiture of the ksuva. Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Teitzei shelo b'ksuva. Both say it's about 4 lines up from the bottom. Da'amari ef shebi ishin adronis. Avagita bayi midivreim misveka kevan delo parish tomadaiti nami anadronis. So both say it's very interesting. So now we're introduced to something new over here. So in the first part of the Mishnah, right? So remember, the man Reuven is making an explicit t'nai. So if he makes this tonight, I'm marrying you on the condition that you have no nedarim. I'm marrying you on the condition you have no woman. Okay, so that's a t'nai. You make a t'nai, there's violation of the t'nai, there's no kiddushin. In case number 2, what you're introduced to say is that there's also like a general assumption about what a man wants in marriage. He doesn't want a woman who makes nedarim. He doesn't want a woman who has mumin. So even if he didn't make a t'nai, but it turns out that she's made nedarim, or she's had this particular category of blemishes, so halacha said that is grounds for divorce, still with a get, but with forfeiture of a ksuva. Why forfeiture of a ksuva? Because there's a general assumption that had the husband, had Reuven known about these things, he would have what? Not entered into the marriage. So it's like a shtickle mekachtos, like a little bit of like a mekachtos. How do you translate mekachtos? What? Avoided sale. But I'm saying it's avoided sale based on false impressions, right? Based on mistaken notions. Right? So again, it's not Narbosai. If it was a real mekachtos, then what? You wouldn't even need a get. Right, if it was a real mekachtos. So it's not strong enough. It's not strong enough so as to dispense with a get, but it is strong enough ultimately again to go ahead and forfeit ksuva. Okay, let's see the Gemara. Gemara says Tanana migabi ksuvas. So we'll say by ksuva, we saw this same concept, the same halacha in Maseches Ksuvas. Ki hai gavna. So we'll say hacha. Hacha Kiddushin is strichale, Tana Ksuvas atu Kiddushin. So we'll say over here, where the primary discussion is Kiddushin, so you mention Kiddushin, and we bring up Ksuvas as secondary information. Hasam, Ksuvas is strichale, there was some Maseches Ksuvas, the primary discussion is by Ksuvas, Tana Kiddushin atu Ksuvas. Okay, fine. Mishnah, HaMekadesh Shem Hashem Meshava Pruta, so what's the interesting case? Reuven is Mekadesh two women, Rachel and Leah, with one Pruta. Austerity measures, austerity measures, right? So what happens? He goes ahead and he mischadesh two women with one pruta, or one woman with something that is worth less than a pruta. So now obviously there's no kiddushin. Now what's the chiddush in the Mishnah? Now both say this is very interesting. Watch this. So Reuben goes over to Rachel and Leah. He says, ladies, do I have a proposition for you, right? One pruta, and you can spend the rest of your lives with me, right? Now obviously, somebody wasn't paying attention, right? Rachel and Leah, I guess whatever, right? So they say yes. They accept the pruta. Fine. So obviously we know one pruta is not enough to affect Kiddushin with two women. Now what's the chap over here? Afterwards, in celebration of their new Kiddushin, so Reuven sends them gifts. Sivlonos are gifts. Rashi says, Durono shederech chasan v'lshach aruso. He sends gifts. It was the custom that a chasan would send gifts to his kala, right? So he sends them gifts afterwards. Ultimately, again, is no Kiddushin. I will say, now I understand the case. See, what would I have thought? What's going on over here? So he's mekadesh them with less than a shava pruta. Afterwards, he sends them both gifts. Value of the gifts, more than a pruta. Even though he sends them the gifts afterwards, ultimately give them not mekudeshes. Why? Shemachmas Kiddushin Arishonim Shalach. Because Rabbi said this is very interesting, because the gifts are not meant to be kesef Kiddushin. What are the gifts meant to be? Celebration of Kiddushin. So Rabbi say, so you can't count those gifts towards the Kiddushin because that wasn't his intention with those gifts. Right? Those gifts were simply meant to be what? Meant to be, again, gifts, not Kiddushin. Right? And so to, again, a katan who was Mekadesh. I'm going to say, take a look at Rashi. The Gamar v'Shalach Sivlonos, L'Shem Kiddushin, Ela Aminon Machmas Kiddushin Rishonim. So both say, now watch this. So when Reuven is Mekadesh Rachel and Leah with one pruta, and then subsequently sends gifts. So one might have thought that maybe, what Reuven realized, it can't be Mekadesh Shomer with a half a pruta. So what did he do? He sent gifts to bolster the Kesef Kiddushin. Says Gemara, no, that's not what happened over here. The way Sivlonos, the way gifts work is gifts are gifts. They're not Kesef Kiddushin. And therefore the Kiddushin is invalid, even though again he subsequently sent gifts, because ultimately again, the gifts are reckoned as gifts, not as additional kesef kiddushin. Good. And Gemara says the same thing if you have a katan who was mekadesh. So we'll say, imagine for a moment, Reuven is a katan, gives kesef kiddushin to Rachel, who's a gedolah. What's the status of that kiddushin? What's the status? Void, right? No. We'll say, let's say subsequently, once he becomes a bar mitzvah, he takes his bar mitzvah money, right? Now he's a man, right? A bar mitzvah boy is a man, right? So he takes his bar mitzvah money and he sends gifts to Rachel. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Still no kiddushin. Why? Because we don't view gifts as a bolstering of the kesef kiddushin. Rather, we view gifts as gifts. and not Kesef Kiddushin. Therefore, what the Gemara is saying is, in these cases of invalid Kiddushin, even though the chassan subsequently sent gifts, the gifts don't bolster the deficient Kesef Kiddushin. The gifts are viewed as independent gifts, and therefore no Kiddushin in this case. Says the Gemara, Tzricha, why do I need both of these cases? Now, essentially, Rabbi said there are three cases, right? Case number one is two women with one pruta. Case number two is one woman with a half a pruta. And case number three is the katan who is mekadesh lono. All three of these cases, Ruvain gave deficient kesef kiddushin, subsequently sent gifts. I might have thought that the gifts bolster the kesef kiddushin. Kamash malan, they do not. Why do all these cases? It's tricha. Here we go. The ashman and shava pruta. If we would have just mentioned the case of shava pruta, in other words, we'll say that would be the case of two women with one pruta. I did the kanafik mamona mine toy. Avapachos min shava pruta. So we'll say. So ultimately, again, listen. I understand maybe in the case of Ruvain, who is Mekadesh, two women with one pruta. So we'll say, why is he making a mistake in this case? Because we'll say, this happens when you pay attention to part of the shir, right? Which part of the shir did he learn? You can Mekadesh woman with a pruta. So he thought that what? One pruta gets you as many wives as you want, right? One pruta, all you need, right? Give me a pruta, I'll give you the world, right? Right? Just take one pruta and that's all. And that's that, right? That's all you need. So I'll say he's giving in that case, he's giving a unit of Kiddushin. That's where he makes a mistake. So he makes a mistake. So we'll say, so that's why he thinks he gave proper Kiddushin, and that's why subsequent sending of gifts does not bolster the case of Kiddushin. They'll say, but when he gives less than a shavar pruta, come on. Everyone knows that pachos mishavar pruta. We'll say, what could you accomplish with less than a pruta? What could you accomplish less than a pruta? Nothing. And everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. So he realizes his mistake, and therefore what? V'chi kameshader savlonos aidaita the kiddushin kameshader. And therefore, when he subsequently sends the gifts, I will say, what's his intention with the gifts? What's his intention? To bolster the kiddushin. To bolster the kiddushin. And maybe I would have thought that case, the subsequent gifts do work to bolster the kiddushin. The Ashwin and Hani Tartef would have just said the first two cases of two women with one pruta, or one with a half a pruta, mishum the bain pruta lapachos shavar pruta lo kim luhula inshi. Because many people make mistakes ultimately between a whole pruta, half a pruta, aval katan shekidish. Also in the case of a katan who's mekadesh woman, hakol yodin shein kiddushay katan klum. Everyone knows that a katan can't affect kiddushin, and therefore what? Ema ki kameshader sivlonos adaited the kiddushin kameshader. And I might have thought that maybe when the katan becomes bar mitzvah and sends the gifts, maybe that should work, because everyone knows that a katan can't affect kiddushin. Therefore, when he subsequently sends the gifts, ultimately again, that should affect kiddushin. Kamash malan, it doesn't. It doesn't. So therefore, I will say halacha l'maisa. Therefore, all three cases. So therefore, case number one, man is mekadesh woman, one pruta, two women. Case number two, man is mekadesh woman with half a pruta. Case number three, a katan is mekadesh woman. In all three of these cases, there's not enough kesef kiddushin given. In all three of these cases, chassan subsequently sends gifts to the kala. I might have thought that the gifts bolster the kesef kiddushin. Kamash malan, it doesn't. Kamash malan, it doesn't. It marafuna amr choshen l'savlonos. So we'll say now in a little bit of a change of things. Rav Huna says no. You have to be choshesh that gifts that are sent actually have the ability to bolster deficient kesef kiddushin. The Chinam Rabbi said as well. Chosheshin. Shabbos Rashi is over Choshen Sivlonos. Misha Shidech Beishav and Isratza Vekidem V'Shalach Sivlonos Be'edim Choshen Shem Kiddushin Hein V'Miskach La'achar Tzich again. I will say, here's what's interesting. What Rav Huna is saying is like this. Let's say Reuven and Rachel decided to get married. Now they haven't formalized anything, right? I don't know. She's saying he hasn't given her kesef kiddushin. Then what happens? He sends her gifts. So Rav Huna says you have to be concerned that maybe those gifts ultimately again have the status of kesef kiddushin, right? So we'll say, and that would mean, by the way, that if after receiving the gift, right, she decides, you know what, I don't want to marry you anymore, that perhaps she should need a get. Pretty dramatic. The Rabbi said also, you have to be choshesh that maybe the sending of gifts, maybe a gift actually affects Kiddushin. Amar Rabba, umos vinon ashmaitin. We bring up the Mishnah. The Mishnah clearly says, or we'll say that what? That gifts do not have the status of Kesef Kiddushin. Abaye says, no. Hasam kidiktani taimo shemachmas Kiddushin harishonim shalach. Abaye says, that's not fair. In the Mishnah's case, remember again, Kesef Kiddushin was given, albeit deficient Kesef Kiddushin. And then the Mishnah's case was that subsequent gifts cannot be viewed as bolstering deficient Kesef Kiddushin. That's different than our case that we're dealing with over here, where a man and woman decided to get married, haven't done anything yet, right? But then Ruvain sends Rachel gifts. That's where Rabbah or Rav Huna are ultimately saying that maybe those gifts represent Kesef Kiddushin. Ikidar, an alternate version of this. Amar Rabbah, Minamin Allah. From where do I know this? Kidik Tani Taima, Shemachmas Kiddushin Arishonim Shalach. So I'll say it's only the case in the Mishnah where one can make a mistake. However, Ba'alma Havi Kiddushin. But perhaps generally, gifts not given as a follow-up to Kesef Kiddushin, but gifts given after a couple decides to get married, Perhaps that can affect proper Kiddushin. Abaye says, no. I will say, when a chassan sends a kala a gift, right? A man and woman decide to get married. And in celebration of that, right, Ruvain sends Rachel a gift. That is not Kesef Kiddushin at all. Al afilu hacha did nachas latoras Kiddushin, ema havi Kiddushin. So we'll say the Chiddush is our Mishnah. What's the Chiddush in our Mishnah? Here, Ruvain gave Rachel an item of value, albeit not enough, but I would have thought again, at least in that case, gifts should help to bolster Kesef Kiddushin. Kamash Molan, they do not. Okay, so we'll say, my Havi Allah, what is Balma? So we'll say, so we have over here is a little bit of a tension about, namely, what is the status of gifts? So now, by the way, we have two different cases of gifts. The case in the Mishnah was where deficient Kesef Kiddushin was given. It was followed up by gifts. I might have thought that gifts work to bolster Kesef Kiddushin. The Mishnah says, Kamash Malon, they do not. Then there was another case of gifts introduced, which was Chassan and Kal, right? I should say, Reuven and Rachel decide they want to get married. Nothing's happened yet. Reuven sends Rachel gifts. I might have thought that those gifts should count as Kesef Kiddushin. Kamash Malon, they do not. Although according to some opinions, they do. So my Havi Allah. So I'll say, so what's the halacha? My Havi Allah, what is the bottom line? So in other words, Amra Papa, it depends. This is fascinating. We'll say in a place where it is common to go ahead and first give Kesef Kiddushin, and then what? And then send gifts. We'll say in that case, Chashinon, maybe halacha l'maisa. In a case where there is deficient Kesef Kiddushin, maybe the gifts serve to bolster the Kesef Kiddushin. So the Gemara says, Basra da Mekachi, V'hadir Mesabli, Chashinon, Mesabli V'hadir Mekachi, but in a place where it was common to first send gifts and only then do Kesef Kiddushin, we're not choshesh that gifts should count as Kesef Kiddushin. So the Gemara says, Lo Chashinon, Mekachi, V'hadir Mesabli Pshita. Now we'll say, here's what's interesting. In a case where first you give Kesef Kiddushin, and then what? And then Allah Chalamaisi, you go ahead and send gifts, that maybe the gifts can bolster the Kesef Kiddushin. I hear that. So the Gemara says, what's the case over here? Lo tzricha deruba mekachi v'hadir mesabli. The majority of people first do Kiddushin and then send gifts. Right, and then send gifts. Umiuta mesabli v'hadir mekachi. But a miut, a minority, ultimately send gifts and then do Kiddushin. I would have thought, maybe it should be choshish for the minority. Kamash Mullah, no, you're not. So, okay. So I just want to point out over here something very interesting. Just the way you should, the way we paskin. I will say we paskin like the straight reading of the Mishnah. So there is, so in other words, halacha l'maisa, if a man gives a woman kesef kiddushin, and then ultimately it turns out that for some reason that kesef kiddushin is deficient, right? Like the case we had in the Mishnah, and he subsequently sends her gifts, even though those gifts are being given in what context? What context? The context of gift giving as a part of marriage, those gifts do not count as kesef kiddushin. Right? So we'll say, I'll give you just a perfect case of this. Right? Perfect case. right? Ruvain is Mekadesh Rachel with a half a pruta. Okay? Then we'll say, what happens after he gives her Kesef Kiddushin? He gives her a diamond engagement ring. Diamond engagement ring. So I thought, okay, great. Okay, he gave her half a pruta, but obviously, again, a diamond engagement ring should count as Kesef Kiddushin. It doesn't. It doesn't. The only thing that counts as Kesef Kiddushin, Rabbi say, is what? That which is given explicitly as Kesef Kiddushin. Subsequent gifts are treated as gifts. But Allah Lamaisa cannot make up for deficient Kesef Kiddushin. Incredible. Rabbi says, let's finish up. Let's finish up. So the Gemara says as follows. Boimine. Ravacha Barafuna Merava. Hochsak Shtak Suva B'Shuk. It's a totally different case. We'll say, watch this. What happens? What happens in the following situation? What happens, we'll say, if in the marketplace they find the ksuva between Ruvain and Rachel. So we'll say, Mahu. Is a found ksuva enough to go ahead and establish a woman as a married woman? Interesting, right? So again, we have no other record of Ruvain being married to Rachel. We find the ksuva in the shuk that says Ruvain married, Ruvain is ksuva to Rachel. What's the halacha? Amar le, v'chim mesha machzik shtar ksuva b'shuk, right? Nachzik ba ke'eshes ish. Just because you find the ksuva, we're going to treat her as a married woman. So finding the ksuva shouldn't be enough. So my habi Allah, what's the bottom line halacha? So it depends. Amar Rashi, Basra the Mekachi v'ader kasik ksuva in a place where ultimately again they first do kiddushin and then write a ksuva chayshinon. So we're saying a place where a ksuva is only written after kiddushin occurs, then what? And you find the kiddushin between Reuven and Rachel. Okay, chayshinon. Now we'll say chayshinon just says chayshinon doesn't say definitively she's a married woman, but it says we need to investigate this a little bit. Kasi v'hader Mekachi. There are places apparently where they would write the ksuva even before kiddushin occurred. So if you lived in a place where they wrote, then what? Then lo chashinon, right? Then lo chashinon. So we'll say, so we wouldn't be choshesh. Again, why? Because we'll say it's possible, right? They wrote the ksuva, and then what happened? They just never got married, right? Changed their mind. So mekachi v'hader kasib shita. So we'll say, obviously, if you have a situation where you live in a locale where first they do kiddushin, then they write the ksuva, and you find the ksuva in the marketplace, so of course you have to be choshesh. So pshita. Safra. We'll say, maybe you live in a place where there wasn't a sofer. You didn't have a sofer who lived in town. So we'll say, Ma'udetema, Safru do is Family. So we'll say, I would have felt like this. So watch this. I live in a place, let's say I live in a town where first they do Kiddushin and then they write the Ksuva. Okay, so what's the halacha? Now we find a Ksuva in the marketplace, in the shuk, that has Reuven and Rachel in it. So we'll say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Chashinon. Chashina means what? We suspect that they are married. Because since again in this place, they only go ahead and write a ksuva after Kiddushin was done. And we found the ksuva that says Reuven is married to Rachel, we have to be choshesh. So we'll say, what would I have thought? Well, maybe what happens in this town, they also don't have a sofer. There's not a sofer. So we'll say, what happens is there's not a sofer? Maybe we should be concerned like this. One time, there was a sofer passing through town. Listen, Reuven was on a second date. Reuven was on a second date with Rachel. Reuven on a second date with Rachel. So he figured, you know what, things are going well. And we'll say, my mechutin told me, my Avram married a wonderful young lady from Lakewood. My mechutin told me, in Lakewood it is impossible. It's very difficult to get halls for the wedding. So my mechutin told me that after the third date, he put down a deposit on the hall. He said, I didn't know it was going to happen. He said, I liked your son a lot. I didn't know it was going to happen. I figured, all right, you know what, whatever, I'll lose the deposit, I'll transfer the deposit. But you know, sometimes again, you know, you gotta get the ball rolling. You gotta get the ball rolling. So I'll say, so now what happens? So you might have thought like this. We might have thought like this, that halacha l'maisa, I live in a town where they only write the ksuva after Kiddushin. But we have no sofer. We have no sofer. So it happened to be, right, Reuven says there was a sofer rolling through town. I was only on my second date with Rachel. I figured, you know what, what's the worst case scenario, right? I lose a couple of shekel. Okay, fine, it's going to be what it's going to be. So we'll say, maybe that's what happened. And maybe when we find the ksuva in the marketplace, there was no kiddushin. That was just the ksuva written beforehand, even though that's a departure from the local custom. But because they have access to a sofer, kamash malan, we'll say no. Kamash malan, we're not choshesh. Kamash malan, if you live in a locale where the ksuva is normally only written after kiddushin, we assume that what happened? there was Kiddushin, there was a Ksuva, and Chayshinon that Reuven and Rachel aren't married, and we're not Choshesh for outlying circumstances. Rabbi say, I just want to point out what a Musar Haskell, that last piece of Gemara is. So Rabbi say, in life, very often, when we want to undertake something, so we'll say, what happens when you want to undertake something? So how does the Yetzer Hara work when you want to undertake a new initiative in life? And by the way, it's not just in your ruchnius, right? It could be in business, it could be in anything, right? You have an opportunity to do something. So what does the Yetzer Hara do? The Yetzer Hara goes ahead and plants 2 words that constantly repeat themselves in your mind. What are the 2 words? Or I'll try, right? I'll try. What if? What if? Right? What if? Well, what if this? And what if that? And what if this? And what if that? And then again, you start playing over all the different things that could happen. So what happens when you start? When you start contemplating your life, every single thing that could go wrong, there's only one logical course of action, which is do nothing. They call this analysis paralysis, right? Analyze anything enough in life, and you will do absolutely. Crossing the street, I don't know, crossing the street, you know what could happen? There's a car, there's a this. And by the way, we'll say all legitimate things. It's not like you're saying, not worried about a vulture swooping down, right, and picking me up, but like legitimate stuff that could technically happen. When you contemplate every single possible thing that could go wrong. And I say, yeah, you have an opportunity in your career, and you contemplate, by the way, this is my Simchol Yom. People often stay, right? Most people are underemployed, right? Why are they underemployed? Because ultimately, again, being underemployed is safe. It's safe. It's predictable, right? Maybe I'm even good at it, kind of like mastered it. It doesn't take any real effort for me. I collect my paycheck. I'm happy, and I go through life. Many people are underemployed in life. I don't mean in their career, right? We underperform. Why? Because they're both saying, I'm scared of all the different possible things that could occur. So therefore, the only logical thing is play it safe. We'll say, what does the Gemara teach us? We'll say, you know what that Kamash of the Gemara says? Ma'u detem, what would you have thought? Safru disrami. The Gemara says, we don't take into account what ifs. Right? In life, you have to live with what is in front of you, make your decisions with what is in front of you, and move yourself forward. Because if you contemplate every single what if in the course of life, if you contemplate the what ifs in your ruchnius, you're never going to go spiritually. If you contemplate all of the what ifs in your business life, you're never going to grow financially. In life, you have to take into account the concepts, or actually not the concepts, the circumstances, the realities you have right in front of you, and just move yourself forward. Probably the most profound Kamash Malan in all of Shas. Don't start worrying about the what if. Maybe the sofa was this, maybe the sofa was that. Lamaisa. You live in a place where they do Kiddushin and then they do a Ksuva. That's what's in front of us. That's what we assume happened. You can't live your life taking into account every single possible scenario, because then you'll move nowhere, you'll accomplish nothing, and you'll fail to self-actualize. What say? Shkoyach. Sure.